My name is Elise Forrester, and I'm about to tell you how my father's death became the catalyst that brought down an empire of greed. I was 34 years old when everything changed, working as a server at Blue Cliff Diner, just another face in the crowd of minimum wage workers trying to make ends meet. What happened next proved that sometimes the most devastating revenge comes not from anger, but from the pursuit of justice. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I stood in Warren Drixley's office, my hands trembling with a mixture of fear and desperation. The regional manager sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled as he regarded me with the cold indifference of a man who had long ago forgotten what it meant to be human. "Please, Mr. Drixley," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My father is dying. The doctors say he only has days, maybe hours. I need to be with him." Warren leaned back in his leather chair, the springs creaking under his considerable weight. At 42, he had the soft, doughy appearance of someone who spent more time counting profits than caring about people. His small, piggy eyes narrowed as he studied me, and I could see the calculations running through his mind, not calculations of compassion or understanding, but of scheduling and profit margins. "Elise," he said, drawing out my name like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "I understand you're going through a difficult time, but I have a business to run. We're already short-staffed this week, and I can't afford to lose another server." "I'm not asking for a vacation," I pleaded, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "This is an emergency. My father is all I have left in this world." Warren's expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened further. "I don't manage grief. Elise, I manage shifts, and your shift starts in 30 minutes. Now, you can either get changed and get to work, or you can clean out your locker and find employment elsewhere. The choice is yours." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, unable to comprehend the callousness of what I was hearing. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The desperation didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else, something colder and more calculated than anything I'd ever felt before. "You're denying me emergency leave to be with my dying father?" I asked, needing to hear him confirm it one more time. "Company policy is clear," Warren replied, already turning his attention to the papers on his desk. "Emergency leave requires 48 hours advance notice and approval from corporate. Your father's condition, while unfortunate, is not my problem." I stood there for a long moment, memorizing every detail of his smug face, the way his jowls shook slightly when he spoke, the gold wedding band that cut into his fleshy finger. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out of his office. I didn't stop at my locker. I didn't change into my uniform. I simply walked out the front door of Blue Cliff Diner and drove straight to St. Mary's Hospital, where my father lay dying. Edward Forrester had been my rock, my anchor, my everything since my mother passed away when I was 12. He'd raised me alone, working long hours at what I'd always believed was a mundane government job to ensure I had everything I needed. As I sat beside his hospital bed, holding his frail hand and listening to the steady beep of the monitors, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was failing him in his final moments. "Elise," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of medical equipment. His eyes, once sharp and intelligent, were clouded with pain medication, but I could see the love in them as clearly as ever. "I'm here, Dad," I said, squeezing his hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere." He smiled weakly, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had stayed up all night helping me with science projects, who had walked me down the aisle at my wedding before my husband decided he preferred his secretary to his wife. "My desk," he managed to say, each word seeming to cost him enormous effort. "Bottom drawer, behind the files, important." I leaned closer, trying to understand. "What's important, Dad? What's in your desk?" But his eyes had already closed, and his breathing had become more labored. I stayed with him for the next 18 hours, holding his hand, talking to him about memories we'd shared, telling him how much I loved him. When the monitors finally flatlined and the nurses rushed in, I knew he was gone before they even began their futile attempts at resuscitation. The funeral was a blur of condolences and casseroles. I moved through it like a ghost, accepting hugs from distant relatives I barely knew, and nodding politely at well-meaning platitudes about how he was in a better place now. What struck me most was how few people actually came. For a man who had lived in the same town for over 30 years, Edward Forrester's funeral was remarkably sparse. It wasn't until I was going through his apartment, trying to sort through a lifetime of accumulated possessions, that I noticed them. Two men in dark suits standing across the street, watching the building. They didn't approach, didn't interfere, but their presence was unmistakable. When I went to the window for a closer look, they were gone. I found my father's desk in his home office, a small room he'd always kept locked when I was growing up. The bottom drawer was locked, but I found the key taped to the underside of the desktop. Behind a collection of innocuous-looking tax files was a single business card. The logo was unfamiliar, a stylized eagle clutching a set of scales, and the only text was a name: Agent Douglas Reed, Office of Treasury Enforcement. I stared at the card, confusion giving way to a growing sense of unease. What was my father involved in? Why had he hidden this card so carefully? And why had he wanted me to find it? 3 days later, I was back at Blue Cliff Diner, not because I wanted to be, but because I needed the job. Funeral expenses had drained what little savings I had, and the bills wouldn't stop coming just because my world had fallen apart. Warren greeted me with his typical smug superiority, making a show of his magnanimity and taking me back despite my unauthorized absence. "I hope we understand each other now, Elise," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "I run a tight ship here, and I can't have employees thinking they can just walk out whenever they feel like it. Consider this your final warning." I nodded, biting my tongue to keep from saying what I really thought. I needed this job, at least for now. But as I tied on my apron and prepared for another soul-crushing shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The card in my pocket seemed to burn against my skin, a constant reminder that my father's life had been more complex than I'd ever imagined. It was during the lunch rush that Agent Douglas Reed walked into my life. He was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He sat in my section, ordered coffee and a sandwich, and waited until I had a moment to breathe before sliding his identification across the table. "Miss Forrester," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite the din of the diner, "I need to speak with you about your father." My heart hammered in my chest as I glanced around, making sure Warren wasn't watching. "I'm working," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't talk now." "I understand," Reed replied, placing a business card on the table. It was identical to the one I'd found in my father's desk. "But this is important. Your father was working on something when he died, something that affects a lot of people, including you." Before I could respond, Warren's voice cut through the air. "Elise, table 12 needs refills. This isn't social hour." Reed stood, leaving a $20 bill beside his half-eaten sandwich. "Call me," he said simply, then walked out. I pocketed the card and the money, my mind racing as I went through the motions of serving customers. What had my father been working on? What did it have to do with me? And why did I have the feeling that my life was about to become much more complicated? That evening, alone in my small apartment, I finally made the call. Reed answered on the second ring, as if he'd been waiting. "Thank you for calling, Miss Forrester," he said without preamble. "I know this must be confusing for you, but I need you to listen carefully. Your father was not just a government employee. He was a forensic accountant for our office, specializing in corporate fraud investigation." I sank onto my couch, trying to process this information. My father was investigating fraud? "For the past 15 years, Reed confirmed. He was one of our best, quiet, methodical, and absolutely incorruptible. His current case, well, that's where things get complicated." "What case?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. "He was investigating a massive fraud scheme involving multiple restaurant chains, including Blue Cliff Diner. We're talking about systematic wage theft, insurance fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The total amount involved is over $50 million. The room seemed to spin around me. Blue Cliff Diner, the place where I'd been humiliated and degraded, was involved in a federal fraud case, and my father had been investigating it. The problem, Reed continued, is that all of Edward's files were encrypted. He was paranoid about security, used a system of his own design. Without the decryption keys, years of work could be lost. We were hoping he might have left some way to access the files, perhaps with someone he trusted. I thought about my father's final words, about the desk drawer and the hidden card. He told me to look in his desk, I said slowly. That's where I found your card. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Miss Forrester, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you have any idea where your father might have hidden the decryption keys? I closed my eyes, thinking back over years of memories, searching for anything that might be relevant. I don't know, I admitted, but I can look. He left me everything in his will. If the keys exist, they're somewhere in his belongings. I appreciate that, Reed said, but I need to warn you. If the people involved in this scheme learn that you might have access to those files, you could be in danger. Your father was very careful to keep you separate from his work for exactly this reason. A chill ran down my spine, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Anger. Raw. Burning anger at the thought that Warren and others like him had not only denied me basic human compassion, but had been stealing from their employees for years. Agent Reed, I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. I want to help. Tell me what I need to do. Over the next few days, I lived a double life. During my shifts at the diner, I played the role of the meek, grateful employee, while secretly observing everything around me with new eyes. I noticed things I'd overlooked before. The way Warren always handled the cash deposits personally, the discrepancies between the hours we worked and what appeared on our paychecks, the way certain deliveries came in unmarked trucks at odd hours. In the evenings, I searched through my father's belongings with a meticulousness that would have made him proud. I found notebooks filled with cryptic symbols, USB drives that required passwords I didn't know, and locked files on his computer that might as well have been written in another language. It was while going through a box of old photographs that I found the first clue. Hidden behind a picture of my mother was a small piece of paper with a series of numbers and letters. At first, I thought it was just random, but something about the pattern seemed familiar. Then it hit me. The numbers corresponded to important dates in our lives. My birthday, my mother's death, my wedding anniversary. Using these dates as a cipher, I managed to unlock one of the USB drives. What I found inside made my blood run cold. Spreadsheets detailing years of systematic theft, emails discussing how to hide money from the IRS, and most damning of all, a list of every employee who had been cheated out of wages, overtime, and benefits. My name was on that list, along with hundreds of others. But there was more. The files revealed that Blue Cliff Diner was just one tentacle of a massive criminal enterprise. The parent company, Fortress Hospitality Group, owned dozens of restaurant chains across the country, all engaged in similar schemes. The scale of the fraud was staggering, and at the center of it all was a name I recognized: Marcus Steinberg, CEO of Fortress and Warren's ultimate boss. As I delved deeper into the files, I began to understand why my father had been so secretive. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. The documents revealed connections to politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials who had been paid to look the other way. My father had been building a case that could bring down not just a company, but an entire network of corruption. I was so engrossed in the files that I almost missed the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. By the time I realized someone was at my door, it was too late. The lock clicked open, and two men entered, their faces hidden behind ski masks. "Where are the files?" one of them demanded, his voice rough with menace. I backed away, my heart pounding. "I don't know what you're talking about." The second man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Don't play dumb. We know Forrester's daughter has them. Hand them over, and maybe you'll walk away from this. My mind raced, searching for a way out. The USB drive was still plugged into my laptop. The incriminating files displayed on the screen. If they got their hands on it, years of my father's work would be destroyed. The files are encrypted, I said, stalling for time. Even if I gave them to you, you couldn't read them. The first man stepped forward, and I caught a glimpse of a tattoo on his wrist, a compass rose with the letters N, S, E, and W replaced by dollar signs. Then you'll decrypt them for us, he said. Before I could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. The men exchanged glances, and I realized that in my panic, I had triggered the emergency alert app on my phone. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving me shaking and alone. When the police arrived, I told them it was a false alarm, that I'd accidentally triggered the app. I couldn't risk telling them the truth, not when I didn't know who could be trusted, but I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment. I packed what I could carry, including my father's files, and checked into a motel under a fake name. The next morning, I called Agent Reed. They know I have the files, I said without preamble. 2 men broke into my apartment last night. Are you safe? Was his immediate response. For now, I said, looking around the dingy motel room. But I can't keep running. We need to move forward with this. Agreed, Reed said. Can you decrypt the rest of the files? I thought about the progress I'd made, the patterns I'd discovered in my father's coding system. I think so, but I'll need time, and I'll need to be somewhere safe. I can arrange that, Reed assured me. But first, I need to know. Are you prepared for what comes next? Once we move forward with this case, there's no going back. These people will do everything in their power to destroy you. I thought about Warren's smug face, about the hundreds of names on that list of cheated employees, about my father dying alone while I served coffee to indifferent customers. They already tried to destroy me, I said. Now it's my turn. Reed arranged for me to stay in a federal safe house, a nondescript apartment in a building filled with similar units. For the next week, I worked around the clock to decrypt my father's files, using every memory, every shared joke, every family tradition as a potential key. Slowly, the full picture emerged. The fraud was even more extensive than I'd imagined. Fortress Hospitality Group had stolen over $300 million over the past decade through various schemes. They had destroyed the lives of thousands of employees, forcing them to work off the clock, denying them benefits, and even stealing their tax refunds through a complex system of shell companies. But what made my blood boil was a series of emails between Warren and Marcus Steinberg discussing the expendable nature of service workers and how they could maximize profits by targeting employees who were unlikely to complain. Single mothers, immigrants, anyone desperate enough to accept whatever crumbs were thrown their way. As I worked, a plan began to form in my mind. The FBI could arrest these people, maybe even convict some of them, but the system that allowed this to happen would remain intact. The workers who had been cheated would get pennies on the dollar, if anything. While lawyers got rich arguing over the corpse of Fortress Hospitality, I wanted more than that. I wanted justice. Agent Reed, I said during one of our daily check-ins, what would happen if someone were to buy these files? There was a long pause. That would be illegal, he said carefully. The files are evidence in a federal investigation. But hypothetically, I pressed, if a competitor wanted to purchase information about Fortress Hospitality's illegal activities, information that could help them take over their market share, while also ensuring justice for the workers. Hypothetically, Reed said slowly, such a transaction would need to be structured very carefully. The purchaser would need to agree to cooperate fully with the federal investigation. They would need to guarantee protection and compensation for all affected workers, and they would need to pay fair market value for the information. And what would fair market value be for information about $300 million in fraud? That would be for the market to decide, Reed said, but I imagine it would be substantial. I smiled for the first time since my father's death. I need you to arrange a meeting with Whitestone Hospitality Group. Tell them Elise Forrester has a business proposition for them. Whitestone Hospitality was Fortress's biggest competitor, a company that had built its reputation on ethical business practices and employee satisfaction. Their CEO, Rebecca Martinez, was everything Marcus Steinberg wasn't: honest, employee-focused, and smart enough to recognize an opportunity when she saw one. The meeting took place in a federal building, with Agent Reed present to ensure everything was above board. I sat across from Rebecca and her team of lawyers, a USB drive containing a sample of the decrypted files on the table between us. "Ms. Forrester," Rebecca began, her voice professional but not unkind, "we understand you have information that might be of interest to us." I slid the USB drive across the table. "This contains evidence of systematic fraud, wage theft, and tax evasion by Fortress Hospitality Group totaling over $300 million. It includes detailed financial records, emails, and a complete list of affected employees." One of the lawyers plugged the drive into a laptop, and I watched as their eyes widened at what they saw. Rebecca maintained her composure, but I could see the calculations running behind her eyes. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "I'm offering you the complete decrypted files for $51 million, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was asking. "In exchange, you agree to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, provide employment opportunities for all current Fortress employees who want them, and establish a fund to compensate workers who were cheated." The lawyers immediately began whispering among themselves, but Rebecca held up a hand to silence them. "Why 51 million? "Because that's what Fortress stole from their employees last year alone," I replied. "Consider it a down payment on justice." The negotiations went on for hours. Lawyers argued about liability and legality, but Rebecca kept bringing the conversation back to the human element. In the end, we reached an agreement. Whitestone would pay $51 million for the files, with the money going into a trust that I would manage for the benefit of affected workers. They would offer jobs to any Fortress employee who wanted one, with full credit for their years of service, and they would cooperate fully with the federal investigation. As I signed the papers, I thought about my father. He had spent years building this case in secret, knowing that someday it would see the light of day. He just hadn't known that I would be the one to finish what he started. With the deal complete and the files transferred, it was time for the next phase of my plan. I returned to work at Blue Cliff Diner as if nothing had happened, biding my time until the perfect moment. That moment came 2 weeks later, during the morning rush. Warren was in rare form that day, berating Penny for dropping a plate and threatening to fire Miguel for being 2 minutes late. I watched him swagger around the diner like a petty dictator, completely unaware that his empire was about to crumble. When he called me into his office to complain about my attitude, I went willingly, a manila envelope tucked under my arm. "Elise," he began, not even looking up from his computer, "I've been noticing a decline in your performance lately. I understand you've been through a difficult time, but I need you to understand that personal problems can't interfere with your work." "I understand completely," I said, placing the envelope on his desk. He frowned, finally looking at me. "What's this?" "Open it," I suggested. With obvious irritation, he tore open the envelope and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. I watched as the color drained from his face as he read the transaction receipt for $51 million, paid by Whitestone Hospitality to the Edward Forrester Workers' Justice Trust. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice suddenly hoarse. "That," I said calmly, "is the receipt for the sale of your company's darkest secrets. Every fraudulent transaction, every stolen wage, every bribe and kickback. It's all been documented, decrypted, and delivered to both Whitestone Hospitality and the FBI." Warren's hands shook as he set down the paper. "You can't. This isn't—" "Legal?" I finished for him. "Completely legal. My father was a federal investigator. Warren. He spent years documenting every crime committed by Fortress Hospitality. And when you told me that his death wasn't your problem, you gave me all the motivation I needed to finish his work." "I'll sue you," he sputtered, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "I'll destroy you." "With what money?" I asked. "Your assets are about to be frozen. The FBI is probably pulling up outside as we speak." "Oh, and that bonus you got last year for reducing labor costs? The one where you stole $68,000 from your employees' paychecks? That's wire fraud. Each transaction is a separate count. You're looking at decades in prison." As if on cue, we heard commotion from the dining room. Through the office window, I could see federal agents streaming into the diner, badges displayed prominently. Warren lurched to his feet, looking wildly around as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "You did this," he said, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You destroyed everything." "No," I corrected him. "You destroyed everything the moment you decided that workers were expendable. I just made sure you faced consequences for it." Agent Reed appeared in the doorway, flanked by two other agents. "Warren Drixley, you're under arrest for wire fraud, tax evasion, and violation of federal labor laws. You have the right to remain silent." As they led Warren away in handcuffs, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. This had been the moment I'd worked toward for weeks, but now that it was here, I realized it was just the beginning. The next few months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and transformation. The federal raids on Fortress hospitality locations made national news, with reporters breathlessly describing the scope of the fraud. Marcus Steinberg was arrested at his country club, led away in handcuffs while news cameras rolled. I found myself at the center of it all, testifying in multiple cases, giving interviews to journalists, and working with Rebecca Martinez to ensure that every affected worker was compensated. The $51 million became the seed money for something much larger, a complete transformation of how the restaurant industry treated its workers. The trial of Warren Drixley was particularly satisfying. I sat in the courtroom as a key witness, watching as prosecutors methodically dismantled his defense. His lawyers tried to paint him as a small cog in a large machine, just following orders from above, but when I took the stand and presented email after email, where Warren bragged about his cost-cutting measures and mocked the workers he was stealing from, that defense crumbled. "Ms. Forrester," the prosecutor asked me, "can you read this email from Mr. Drixley to Marcus Steinberg dated March 15th of last year?" I looked at the printed email, remembering the sick feeling I'd had when I first discovered it. It says, "Managed to cut another 8% from labor this quarter. These idiots don't even realize they're working off the clock. Too desperate to complain. It's like taking candy from babies, except babies would put up more of a fight." The jury's expressions hardened with each piece of evidence. When Warren took the stand in his own defense, he tried to appear contrite, claiming he was under pressure to meet impossible targets, but under cross-examination, his true nature emerged. He couldn't help but sneer at questions about worker rights, couldn't hide his contempt for the people he'd exploited. The verdict was never in doubt, guilty on all counts. As the judge read out a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, Warren turned to look at me. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something I'd never seen in them before: fear. But Warren was just one head of the Hydra. The trials stretched on for over a year, with dozens of executives, managers, and co-conspirators facing justice. Some fled the country, others tried to make deals. But the evidence my father had compiled was too comprehensive, too damning for anyone to escape completely. Meanwhile, I worked with Rebecca Martinez and a team of labor lawyers to establish the Edward Forrester Workers Alliance, using the settlement money and additional funds from Whitestone. We created an organization dedicated to investigating wage theft and supporting workers who had been cheated by their employers. Our first major victory outside of the Fortress case came 6 months later. A luxury hotel chain had been engaging in similar practices, stealing tips from housekeeping staff and manipulating time cards. One of the workers, Maria Santos, came to us with evidence, and we were able to build a case that resulted in a $15 million settlement. "You've given us hope," Maria told me after the settlement was announced. "For years, we thought no one cared, that this was just how things were. But you showed us that we matter. that we can fight back. As the alliance grew, we expanded our scope. We funded legal clinics in low-income neighborhoods, created a hotline for workers to report wage theft, and lobbied for stronger labor protections at the state and federal level. What had started as a personal quest for revenge had transformed into a movement. One day, about 2 years after Warren's arrest, I received a letter forwarded from the federal prison where he was serving his sentence. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. His handwriting was shaky, the words rambling and self-pitying. He blamed his childhood, his education, the pressure of capitalism. He said he was a victim too, that I couldn't understand the stress he'd been under. I read the letter once, then filed it away in the same drawer where I kept the evidence of his crimes. I never responded. Some people deserved forgiveness, but Warren Drixley wasn't one of them. He had chosen cruelty when kindness would have cost him nothing. He had built his success on the suffering of others and felt entitled to their pain. The Edward Forrester Workers Alliance continued to grow, taking on larger and more complex cases. We exposed wage theft in industries from retail to tech, recovering hundreds of millions of dollars for workers who had been cheated. Each victory felt like a tribute to my father, a man who had dedicated his life to justice and passed that legacy on to me. 5 years after that horrible day in Warren's office, I stood before a congressional committee testifying about the need for stronger federal protections against wage theft. The room was packed with reporters, advocates, and workers who had traveled from across the country to share their stories. My father once told me that evil triumphs when good people do nothing, I said, looking directly at the senators assembled before me. For too long, we've allowed employers to steal from their workers with impunity. We've treated wage theft as a civil matter when it's actually a form of robbery. It's time for that to change. The legislation we were advocating for wouldn't solve everything, but it was a start. Criminal penalties for wage theft, increased funding for enforcement, and protection for workers who reported violations. It was the kind of systemic change my father would have been proud of. After the hearing, I was approached by a young woman who looked nervous but determined. "Ms. Forrester," she said, "my name is Ashley. I work at a call center where they're making us work off the clock. I didn't know who else to turn to." I smiled and handed her my card. "You came to the right place. Let's talk about how we can help." As I walked out of the Capitol building, I thought about how different my life had become. I was no longer a server struggling to make ends meet, no longer at the mercy of petty tyrants like Warren Drixley, but more importantly, I had found my purpose. Every worker who got their stolen wages back, every employer who faced justice, every law that was strengthened, it all honored my father's memory. The sun was setting over Washington, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere, in a federal prison, Warren Drixley was eating dinner off a metal tray, counting down the days of a sentence that would consume most of his remaining years. His company was gone, his wealth confiscated, his reputation destroyed. He had lost everything because he couldn't show basic human compassion to a grieving daughter. But this was never really about Warren. He was a symptom of a diseased system, a system that valued profits over people and treated workers as disposable resources. The real revenge wasn't in his personal destruction. It was in the transformation of that system, one case at a time, one law at a time, one worker at a time. As I headed to my hotel, my phone buzzed with messages from the Alliance team. New cases to investigate, new battles to fight, new victories to win. The work would never truly be done, but that was okay. My father had dedicated his life to justice, and now I would do the same. The girl who had begged for a few days off to be with her dying father was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't personal. It's systemic. It's not about destroying one enemy, but about changing the entire battlefield. It's about taking your pain and transforming it into power, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's been stepped on, dismissed, and discarded. Warren Drixley had told me that my father's death wasn't his problem. He was wrong. It became the problem that brought down an empire, that changed an industry, that gave voice to the voiceless. And in the end, That was the only revenge that mattered. The Edward Forrester Workers Alliance now operates in all 50 states, with a team of over 200 investigators, lawyers, and advocates. We've recovered more than $1 billion in stolen wages and helped pass legislation in 37 states strengthening protections for workers. Every day, we receive calls from workers who have been cheated, and every day, we fight for them. I keep a photo of my father on my desk, the one where he's smiling at my college graduation. Sometimes, when a case is particularly difficult, or when the forces arrayed against us seem insurmountable, I look at that photo and remember his words. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. I'm not doing nothing. None of us are doing nothing anymore. And that, more than any personal vendetta or individual victory, is the revenge that truly matters. It's the revenge that builds something better from the ashes of what was destroyed. It's the revenge that honors the dead by protecting the living. It's the revenge that transforms grief into purpose and pain into power. Warren Drixley thought he was untouchable because he was part of a system that had operated with impunity for decades. He was right about the system, but wrong about one thing. Systems are made of people, and people can change. Sometimes all it takes is one person pushed too far. One grieving daughter denied a final goodbye. One moment of cruelty that sparks a revolution. My name is Elise Forrester, and this is how I turned the worst day of my life into a movement that changed everything, not through violence or hatred, but through the patient, methodical pursuit of justice, the same pursuit that had defined my father's life and now defines mine. The diner where it all started is under new management now, part of the Whitestone family of restaurants. They pay fair wages, offer benefits, and treat their workers with dignity. Sometimes I stop by for coffee, sitting in the same section I used to serve. The new servers don't know who I am, and that's fine. I'm not there for recognition. I'm there to remember where I came from and why the work continues. Because somewhere right now, another worker is being told their family emergency isn't their boss's problem. Somewhere, another employee is discovering their paycheck is short. Somewhere, another Warren Drixley is building his success on the backs of the desperate and vulnerable. But now they know we're watching. Now they know there are consequences. Now they know that sometimes the person they step on today might be the one who brings them down tomorrow. That's the real lesson of this story. Not that revenge is sweet, though I won't lie and say there wasn't satisfaction in watching Warren led away in handcuffs. The real lesson is that individual acts of cruelty can spark collective action, that one person's pain, channeled correctly, can become the catalyst for systemic change. My father died believing his work might make a difference someday. He was right. It just took his daughter, a denied leave request, and the perfect storm of grief and determination to bring his vision to life. Every worker who gets a fair wage, every employer who thinks twice before stealing from their employees, every law that protects the vulnerable, they're all part of Edward Forrester's legacy. And Warren Drixley? He's a cautionary tale, a reminder that karma has a long memory and that sometimes the server you dismiss today might be the one holding your future in their hands tomorrow. He thought he was managing shifts. In the end, he was managing his own downfall. One cruel decision at a time. The office of the Edward Forrester Workers Alliance is buzzing with activity as I finish this account. Young lawyers fresh out of law school work alongside veteran investigators. Former victims of wage theft now help others navigate the system. The walls are covered with photos of workers we've helped, testimonials from families whose lives have been changed, and news clippings documenting our victories. In the center of it all, mounted prominently where everyone can see it, is a simple plaque with my father's favorite quote: "Justice delayed is justice denied." We don't delay anymore. We act swiftly, decisively, and without mercy for those who would exploit the vulnerable. This isn't the life I planned. I thought I'd spend my years serving coffee and struggling to make ends meet, but sometimes the worst moments of our lives redirect us toward our true purpose. My father's death and Warren's cruelty didn't break me. They revealed who I was meant to be. The girl who walked out of Blue Cliff Diner that day, tears in her eyes and desperation in her heart, couldn't have imagined where that path would lead. She couldn't have known that her personal tragedy would become the spark that lit a nationwide movement for workers' rights. She couldn't have predicted that the man who denied her basic compassion would spend decades in prison, his name synonymous with corporate greed and worker exploitation. But that's the thing about revenge. The best kind isn't quick or simple. It's not about causing pain for pain's sake. True revenge is about transformation, taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and turning it into the catalyst for something better. It's about ensuring that what happened to you doesn't happen to others. It's about building a legacy that outlasts both the victim and the perpetrator. Warren Drixley will die in prison, largely forgotten except as a footnote in the larger story of corporate accountability. The Edward Forrester Workers Alliance will continue long after I'm gone, protecting workers and pursuing justice for generations to come. That's the difference between petty vengeance and true justice. One destroys, the other builds. One is personal, the other is universal. One satisfies for a moment, the other changes the world. My father knew this. He spent years quietly building his case, knowing he might not live to see it completed. He trusted that someone would finish what he started, that justice would eventually prevail. He was right, and every day, as I continue his work, I feel his presence, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living legacy that grows stronger with each victory. The phone rings. Another worker needing help. Another case to investigate. Another opportunity to honor my father's memory and ensure that no one else has to choose between their job and their dying parent. I answer it with the same words I use every time. Edward Forrester Workers Alliance. How can we help you? Because in the end, that's what this is all about. Not revenge, but help. Not destruction, but construction. Not hate, but hope. Warren Drixley and men like him turned their workers' desperation into profit. We turn that same desperation into power. The power to fight back, to demand justice, and to build a world where work comes with dignity, not degradation. My name is Elise Forrester, and this is my story. But it's also the story of every worker who's been cheated, every family that's struggled to make ends meet, every person who's been told their problems don't matter. We matter. Our problems matter. And thanks to my father's legacy, and one man's fatal mistake in denying a grieving daughter her final goodbye, we now have the power to prove it. The revolution didn't start with protests or politics. It started with a simple request. Please, Mr. Drixley, my father is dying. His response, I don't manage grief, I manage shifts, became the epitaph for an entire system of exploitation, and from its ashes, we built something better. That's the ultimate revenge. Not just winning, but ensuring that the game itself changes. Not just defeating your enemy, but creating a world where such enemies can no longer exist. Not just personal satisfaction, but universal transformation. Warren thought he was untouchable. My father knew better, and now, so does everyone else.